The letter hit the table like a gunshot. Julia Talbot stared at the words penned in the neat, officious hand of a man who had never once gotten his boots dirty, and she felt something cold and certain settle deep in her chest. Not panic, not grief, something harder than either of those things. The Harlan Bank and Trust Company of Abilene, Kansas, was formally notifying her that the Talbot Seed Ranch, all 340 acres of it, the irrigation channels her father had dug by hand, the germination sheds he had built board by board, the experimental seed vaults buried 6 feet under the eastern pasture, was to be seized for outstanding debt no later than the 15th of September, 1882. That gave her exactly 31 days. She was still reading the letter for the third time when the shadow fell across her doorway. He was tall enough that the late afternoon sun had to work around him, and he stood with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that moving too quickly in unfamiliar territory got you killed. Dusty from the road, trail-worn, with a week's worth of dark stubble along his jaw and eyes the color of a Kansas thunderstorm. He held his hat in one hand and said nothing, just looked at the ranch yard behind her, at the cracked earth and the wilted rose at the barn with the sagging door, and she watched his face complete the calculation she had seen strangers make 100 times before. Finished. The place looks finished. I am not selling, Julia said, before he opened his mouth. The man blinked. He had clearly not expected that. I was going to ask if you had work, he said. I don't. She folded the letter. I can't afford it. He turned to go, and something in the deliberate patience of that movement made her look at him again, really look at him the way she looked at seeds, carefully, searching for hidden potential beneath a rough exterior. What kind of work are you good for? She asked. He turned back slowly. Most kinds. Julia Talbot stood in the doorway of a ranch that the bank thought was already dead, looked at a drifter who clearly thought the same thing, and made the decision that would change both of their lives entirely. Come back at dawn, she said, and bring your appetite for hard work. His name was Clayton Underwood, and he had not expected to stay. The road that had carried him to the Talbot Ranch on that blistering August afternoon in 1882 was the same road he had been walking, in one form or another, for 3 years. He had ridden out of Dodge City in the spring of 1879 with a dead partner, an empty wallet, and a darkness behind his eyes that he never quite managed to leave behind on any given trail. He had driven cattle up from Texas, punched horses in New Mexico, dug fence posts in Colorado, and somewhere in all of that movement, he had stopped thinking of any one place as a destination and started thinking of the whole restless country as simply the condition he lived inside. He had heard about the Talbot place from a man in the last town, Harwood's Crossing, a small collection of sun-bleached buildings 20 miles east. The man had been drunk and loose-tongued, leaning on the counter of the general store, and he had said that the Talbot woman was finished, that she was sitting out there alone on a dead ranch with a mountain of debt and no hands left, and that the bank was going to eat her up before the month was out. He had said it with the particular satisfaction that certain men take in other people's failure, and Clayton had felt a familiar disgust settle in his gut. He had not ridden toward the ranch with any intention of rescuing anyone. He was not in the business of rescuing. He needed work and he needed wages, and a troubled operation sometimes meant a desperate employer who could not afford to be too particular. That was all it was. That was what he had told himself. He had not expected her. Julia Talbot was 27 years old, though she carried herself with a precision and self-assurance that made people misjudge her age in both directions. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way the ladies' magazines sold, but she had a quality that was harder to look away from than mere beauty, a kind of focused, burning intelligence behind her dark eyes that made a man feel that whatever she looked at was being comprehensively understood. She was medium height and lean from honest physical labor. With dark hair she kept mostly pinned back under a wide-brimmed work hat, and hands that were always, in Clayton's memory of those early days, either carrying something or shaping something or deep in the earth-turning soil. She kept seeds. That was the thing about Julia Talbot that most people in Harwood's Crossing either did not know or did not care to properly comprehend. She was not simply a rancher's daughter trying to hold on to her father's cattle operation. She was a seed keeper in the oldest and most serious sense of that tradition, a woman who had spent the last 12 years, starting when she was 15 years old and her father was still alive to teach her, selecting, preserving, cataloging, and maintaining a living library of seeds that would have been extraordinary anywhere on the frontier. Her father, Thomas Talbot, had been an unusual man by any measure. Born in Ohio, trained briefly as a botanist before the cost of that education outpaced his means, he had come west in 1858 with a specific and peculiar ambition. Most men came west for land or gold or cattle. Thomas Talbot came west for plants. He had theorized, based on his reading and his observations across the eastern states, that the semi-arid grasslands of central Kansas held in their native plant populations a set of traits that could be selectively crossed into crop varieties capable of surviving drought conditions that would destroy conventional eastern cultivars. He wanted to build a seed library that could feed the frontier through bad years. He had spent 20 years doing exactly that, and when he died of pneumonia in the winter of 1880, he left Julia not the conventional inheritance of land and cattle, but something far stranger and more valuable. He left her 340 acres, yes, but more importantly, he left her the knowledge of what lay buried in the seed vaults beneath the eastern pasture, and he left her the training to work with it. The ranch operation itself had been struggling for years before Thomas died. The cattle he kept were few and poorly adapted to drought. The wheat fields were conventional and vulnerable, and the debts he had run up importing equipment and reference books and correspondence with agricultural scientists back east had accumulated quietly, the way snow accumulates before it collapses a roof. By the time Julia was standing alone in January of 1881, looking at the ledger books and the letter from Harlan Bank, she understood that she had inherited both a treasure and a crisis. She had spent 18 months trying to solve both problems simultaneously. The hands she had managed to keep through the spring of 1881 left one by one as wages became uncertain, and by the summer of 1882, she was working the place alone. She had sold the cattle, all but 2 milk cows, to service the most pressing debt. She had converted the main wheat fields to the experimental drought-resistant varieties she had been developing, which was either going to save her or condemn her, depending entirely on whether the science her father had spent his life building was as sound as she believed it to be. She had sealed the seed vaults and was maintaining them with a precision that would have impressed a university botanist, working alone in the early morning hours by lantern light, recording germination rates and cross-pollination results in notebooks that were already filling a second crate. She was not a woman who was finished. She was a woman who was in the middle of the most critical and dangerous gamble of her life, and she needed one more pair of hands to get the harvest in. Clayton showed up at dawn as she had instructed, which already put him above her previous 3 applicants for the informal position of ranch hand, all of whom had come back drunk or not at all. He ate the breakfast she put in front of him without complaining about what it was, which was cornmeal porridge and dried apple, because she was not wasting her limited provisions on impressing a drifter. He listened when she talked, which was not as common as it should have been. And when she showed him what needed doing, the irrigation channel that had silted up, the germination shed roof that was leaking, the section of fence line that a neighbor's bull had broken through the previous week, he simply went and started doing it. She watched him work from the window of the seed house, which was what she called the low stone building her father had built to house the laboratory section of his operation. Clayton Underwood was not a man who needed supervision or encouragement. He was efficient and strong and quiet, and by mid-morning he had cleared more silt from the irrigation channel than she had managed in 2 full days of work the previous week. She brought him water at noon because that was a reasonable thing to do for a man working in August Kansas heat, and they stood at the edge of the cleared channel and she watched him drink. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Missouri," he said, "originally." "What brought you this direction?" He glanced sideways at her in the way she was beginning to recognize as his version of a longer look. "What brings anybody west?" "Depends entirely on the person," Julia said. "Some come for land. Some come running from something. Some are just moving and haven't decided to stop yet." "Maybe all three," he said. "Are you the kind of man who breaks things, Mr. Underwood?" she asked directly. He went very still. "What kind of things?" "Any kind, property, agreements, the trust of people who have extended it to you." He was quiet for a moment, and she respected the fact that he considered the question rather than simply denying it. "I have broken some things in my time," he said finally. "I try to make them right when I can." "That is an honest answer," Julia said. "I will pay you $6 a week in your meals. I cannot promise more than 1 month of work because I don't know yet what the end of this month will look like. But the work is real and I will not waste your time." $6 and meals is fair," Clayton said. "There is one condition," she said. He waited. "The seed house is mine. You don't go in without my permission. You don't touch anything in there without my direction. The work in there is what this whole place depends on, and I can't afford to have it disturbed." Something moved behind his eyes, curiosity, she thought, but he nodded. "Understood." "Good," Julia said. "The fence line needs 3 new posts by sundown." She walked back to the seed house, and she allowed herself one moment of quiet recognition that this arrangement might actually work, before she went back to her germination records. The days built on each other the way days do when people are working hard toward something real. Clayton was up before she was each morning, which surprised her the first time she came out in the gray pre-dawn, and found him already at the barn, feeding the 2 milk cows and checking the small corral where her horse and his trail-worn gelding were stabled side by side. He had a methodical quality to his work that she recognized as coming from deep experience, not just physical strength, but the kind of practical intelligence that develops in a person who has had to solve real problems in real conditions without anyone to consult. He fixed the germination shed roof in 2 days. He cleared the entire irrigation channel in 4. He rebuilt the broken fence section and then, without being asked, identified 2 more weak points along the north line and reinforced those as well. She noticed all of it. She noticed other things too, things she was less interested in noticing. The way he moved through the ranch yard in the early morning, relaxed and purposeful at once. The quietness in him that was not emptiness but depth. The specific moment each evening when the sunset light hit the western field, and he would stop for just a second and look at it with an expression she could not quite name. She had not had time for this kind of noticing in a long time. She was not entirely sure she wanted it. The crisis came closer, as it always does, in the form that is hardest to prepare for. It was the 3rd week of August, 12 days before the bank's deadline, when the rider came. Julia was in the seed house when she heard the hoofbeats, and something in the aggressive rhythm of them made her come to the door. The man who pulled up in the ranch yard was named Grover Tench, and she had been dreading seeing him. He was the agent of Harlan Bank, a thick-necked man in a suit that was too heavy for the heat, with the kind of smile that meant nothing good. He had been to the ranch twice before, and each time had left her feeling contaminated. Clayton had come around the corner of the barn at the sound of hoofbeats and was standing easily near the water trough, watching. "Miss Talbot," Tench said, not getting off his horse, which was a deliberate rudeness she recognized. "I am here to inform you formally that the bank has accepted a purchase offer on this property." Julia felt the cold, hard thing settle in her chest again. "The property is not for sale. The debt against it has been purchased," Tench said. "By Mr. Wade Carlson of the Carlson Land and Cattle Company. As the holder of your debt, Mr. Carlson has the legal standing to proceed with foreclosure if the balance is not settled in full within 30 days, which, as you are aware, you cannot do." He smiled that empty smile. "Mr. Carlson is a reasonable man. He is prepared to offer you favorable terms for a clean transfer of the property, which would include compensation for your personal effects." "My personal effects," Julia said. Her voice was very level. "He understands you have some gardening materials," Tench said, with a deliberate lightness that told her he knew exactly what was in the seed house. "He is willing to allow you to take what you can carry." The rage that went through her was clean and white and total, and she controlled it absolutely, because she had learned from her father that visible emotion was a tool that other people used against you. "Tell Mr. Carlson," she said, "that the debt will be settled in full before the 15th of September. Tell him that any attempt to enter this property before that date will be met with the full application of Kansas property law. And tell him that I said to look elsewhere for his expansion." Tench's smile did not move. "Miss Talbot, be reasonable." "I am being perfectly reasonable," she said. "Good day, Mr. Tench." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked at Clayton with the calculating appraisal of a man reassessing a situation. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. The silence after the hoofbeats faded was very large. "Who is Carlson?" Clayton asked. Julia was already walking back toward the seed house. "A man who has been trying to acquire this valley's land for 3 years. He controls the water rights on the North Creek, and he wants the east pasture because it sits above the best underground water in the county. He bought up the Mercer place last year and the Henderson place the spring before that." She stopped at the seed house door. "He found out about my father's debt somehow. I think the bank agent told him. It doesn't matter. He cannot have this land." "How are you going to settle the debt?" Clayton asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to sell seeds," she said. He absorbed this the way he absorbed most things she said, quietly and completely, without the dismissive laugh that most men would have offered. "How much is the debt?" $412. He was quiet. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You don't," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. "I was thinking that's not an impossible number if the varieties are right and the market exists." "They are right," she said with a certainty that was not arrogance but evidence. "And the market is every farmer between here and Wichita who lost a third of their wheat crop last year to the summer dry spell." "Then tell me what you need," he said. She studied him. There was something in that offer, simple and direct, that hit somewhere unexpected behind her ribs. She pushed it aside. "I need you to finish clearing the south field because the second planting needs to go in this week. And I need you to build 3 more drying racks in the seed house yard because the first harvest is coming in 10 days. "I'll start on the field now," he said. She nodded and went inside. She sat down at the workbench with her germination notebooks and the accumulated evidence of 12 years of work, and she allowed herself to feel, for just a moment, the true weight of what she was carrying. Her father's life's work. The 340 acres he had turned from raw prairie into a functioning seed operation. The knowledge she had spent half her lifetime absorbing. The 107 distinct seed varieties in the vaults beneath the eastern pasture, some of them not found in any other collection on the continent, all of them selected and preserved by her father's hands and then her own. She was not going to let a man like Carlson bury it. She opened her notebook and went back to work. The drying racks went up in 2 days, and they were better than she had asked for. Clayton built them with a joinery that showed a careful intelligence, adjustable slat spacing to accommodate different seed sizes, covered with cheesecloth she had not had to suggest, positioned to maximize the afternoon wind that came reliably from the southwest. When she came out to inspect them on the second morning, she stood and looked at them for a long moment without speaking. "These are better than what I described," she said finally. "The cheesecloth was in the barn," he said. "I figured it was there for something." "It was there for exactly this," she said. "Thank you." It was the most direct personal thing she had said to him in 12 days of working side by side, and the air between them did something quiet and significant that neither of them addressed. She started bringing him into the seed house. Not all at once, and not without careful instruction, but the sheer volume of the harvest processing required more than one pair of hands, and she had watched him long enough to trust the quality of his attention. She showed him the basic cleaning process for the wheat varieties first, the simplest task, and the one where mistakes were easiest to catch. She showed him the record-keeping system, the coded labels and the germination log, and the segregation process that kept experimental crosses from contaminating established variety stocks. He was meticulous, more than meticulous. He asked questions that were good questions, that showed he was actually thinking about the underlying logic of what she had built rather than just executing the task in front of him. He caught his own mistakes before she pointed them out. When she explained why a particular variety was segregated from the others, the long chain of selection events and observed characteristics and drought survival data that made it what it was, he listened with an absorption that reminded her of her father. "You developed this yourself?" he asked one evening, holding up a labeled envelope containing what looked like ordinary wheat seed, but was in fact 3 generations of selective crossing between a turkey red wheat and a drought-resistant native grass relative she had identified in the western pasture. "My father began the crossing," she said. "I carried it through the last 2 generations. How many years?" 6 years for this one. The turkey red cross started in 1876. He turned the envelope over in his hands. "And you believe it will survive conditions that would kill conventional wheat?" "I don't believe it," she said. "I know it. I have grown test plots under controlled reduced water conditions for 2 consecutive seasons. The yield reduction under drought stress is 40%. A conventional turkey red will lose 75% or more under the same conditions." He looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that was different from his usual focused attention, something that had crossed over into genuine, undisguised awe. "That is," he said and stopped, as though the sentence required recalibration. "Miss Talbot, that is genuinely extraordinary." She felt warmth rise in her face which she was not prepared for and did not welcome. "It is scientific method applied consistently," she said briskly. "My father was the theoretical architect. I have been the laborer." "You have been both," he said quietly, and the simplicity of it, the absolute conviction in his voice, was more disarming than any flowery compliment would have been. She turned back to her notebook and said nothing, because she did not quite trust what might come out of her mouth in that moment. He had a dark past. She found out about it in pieces, the way you find out most true things about people, not through a single revelation but through the accumulation of details that eventually build a complete picture. He had been a lawman. She learned that first, from something he said obliquely about recognizing the methods of a man like Tench, the language of legal intimidation dressed up as procedure. When she pushed on it, he told her that he had served as a deputy in Dodge City for 2 years, from 1877 to 1879. What had ended it took longer to learn. She extracted it one piece at a time over the course of several evenings, the natural conversation that develops between 2 people sharing a meal at the end of a hard day's work. His name had been Roy Dunbar, his partner in the law office, and they had been closer than most brothers for the 3 years before his time as deputy. In the spring of 1879, a situation had developed with a land dispute in which a cattleman named Morrison had been paying off the town sheriff to ignore certain trespasses against smaller homesteaders. Clayton had been building a case against Morrison quietly, gathering affidavits, documenting the betrayal of office at the highest level of the local law. Roy had known about it. Roy had told Morrison. Clayton had gone to confront Morrison alone without backup because he had trusted Roy with the information about when he was going to do it, and Morrison had been waiting. There had been a fight in which 2 of Morrison's men had been hurt badly, and Clayton had survived by luck and stubbornness. Roy had disappeared the same night with $200 of Morrison's money in his pocket. "I should have seen it," Clayton said. Looking back, the signs were there. Roy had debts I didn't know about. He had been pulling away from me for months. I thought it was something between us, some friction that would resolve. I didn't think it was that. People hide things that they are ashamed of, Julia said. He wasn't ashamed enough. That is a different thing from being ashamed. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in both hands. The evening light was the slow amber of late August, coming through the cabin's single window at an angle that caught the dust motes floating in the warm air. After that, I couldn't stay in Dodge, he said. Everything about the place was contaminated by it. The betrayal. The fact that I had been so wrong about a person I trusted with everything. So you started moving. So I started moving. She understood that. Not the specific event, but the underlying logic of it. The way a catastrophic failure of trust could make permanence feel dangerous. She had a version of her own, less dramatic but equally definitive. When my father died, she said, surprising herself with her own candor, his lawyer came and sat across from me at that table and told me very gently that I should consider selling the place to a buyer he had already identified, because a woman alone could not manage a going concern. He had already drafted the papers. He was very kind about it. He had my best interests at heart, he said. What did you do? I asked him to leave my property and I went into the seed house and I stayed there for 6 hours going through my father's work, she said. And when I came out, I knew exactly what I was going to do. You were going to fight, Clayton said. I was going to grow, she said. There is a difference. Fighting is reactive. Growing is something you decide to do regardless of what anyone else is doing. He looked at her across the table with the thunderstorm eyes, and she felt the warmth again, more persistent this time, more clearly located behind her sternum. I think you are the most formidable person I have ever met, he said, very quietly. She cleared her plates from the table and thanked him for the compliment in a tone that was a little too crisp to be entirely natural. The moment of spectacular, genuinely staggering revelation came on the 22nd day of August. She had been watching the experimental wheat field with increasing anxiety for the previous week, because the heat had intensified beyond anything she had planned for, and even her drought-resistant varieties were showing signs of stress at the edges of the field. The conventional wisdom, the wisdom that Tench had certainly carried back to Carlson, would have been that the crop was at risk, that the harvest would be inadequate, that the financial plan was collapsing. Clayton had been worried too. She could see it in the way he checked the field each morning, the careful assessment in his expression. She had said nothing. On the morning of the 22nd, she walked out to the experimental field before sunrise with her germination log and her father's original breeding records, and she conducted a field assessment that took her 3 hours and covered every planting section. When she came back to the ranch yard, Clayton was at the well, filling the morning water buckets, and he looked at her with the question plain in his face. The field is fine, she said. He looked at the field. The outer edges were showing stress. The east section is a sacrificial planting, she said. I planted a conventional wheat variety there deliberately to draw the visual comparison. Anyone looking at this field from the road or from the ridge sees a crop in trouble. What is actually in trouble is 40 feet of conventional wheat that I planted specifically to be in trouble. The drought-resistant varieties are in the interior sections, and they are performing exactly as the data predicted. Some minor leaf curl, which is a known stress response that does not affect seed viability. No significant yield loss. He stared at her. The harvest will be sufficient to produce the seed stock I need, she said. I have arranged, through correspondence with 3 farming communities east of here, to demonstrate the drought survival data at harvest. 2 of the communities have already made preliminary commitments to purchase. If those commitments hold, and I have every reason to believe they will because last year's drought losses have made these men desperate for alternatives, I will have the funds to settle the debt before the 15th. The look on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He was not simply surprised. He was struck. She could see the full force of it moving through him, the realization that while everyone, including himself, had been watching the obvious surface story of a woman struggling to hold on, she had been executing a precise, multi-layered, scientifically grounded strategy that had been invisible to everyone who did not know how to look at it correctly. "You planned this," he said. "All of it. From the beginning." "From the day the letter arrived," she said. "The conventional wheat at the edges. The correspondence with buyers. The timing of the harvest." "The timing of the harvest is the critical variable," she said. "The seed needs to be fully mature and properly dried before it can be sold, and the harvest window is narrow. That is why I needed the additional hands. It's not the physical labor I lacked. It's the processing speed." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down on the edge of the water trough, which was not a thing she had ever seen Clayton Underwood do in the middle of a working morning, and he looked at her with an expression that was open in a way she had not yet seen from him. "I rode in here thinking this place was done," he said. "I thought you were fighting a losing battle, and maybe I could make $1 helping you slow the loss. I know that's what you thought. I was completely wrong." "Yes," she said, without any softness to cushion it because she had not built this to be modest about. "You were." And then he laughed. It was the first full laugh she had heard from him, not a dry humor or a wry acknowledgement, but a genuine laugh that came from deep somewhere, and it transformed his face entirely. "Miss Talbot," he said, "I believe you may be the most extraordinary woman in the state of Kansas." The warmth behind her sternum was not going to be ignored this time. She looked at him steadily and said, "Help me get this harvest in, Mr. Underwood, and I will let you watch me prove it." The next 10 days were the hardest and most alive either of them had been in years. The harvest work was grueling and precise simultaneously, which is the worst combination physically but the most satisfying intellectually. The wheat had to come in at exactly the right moment, section by section, because the seed quality window was narrow and could not be rushed. Julia worked from before dawn to after dark, and Clayton worked alongside her in the same rhythm, learning the specific requirements of each variety from her as they went, asking the right questions at the right moments, developing a feel for the work that she had not expected from someone who had come to it with no background. They developed a system together. She would assess the readiness of each section in the early morning and set the order of harvest. He would cut and gather while she began the initial sorting and cleaning in the seed house. By midday they would switch, him taking the first harvest batches through the cleaning racks while she moved to the next section. By evening they would be doing the record-keeping and label preparation together by the light of the oil lamp at the big work table in the seed house. Being in the seed house together in the lamplight evenings was something Julia was going to have to think carefully about, because it was doing things to her defenses that 12 years of careful independence had not prepared her for. He handled her father's notebooks with a reverence that undid her. Not the exaggerated care of someone who is performing respect, but the genuine attention of a person who recognizes real work when they see it. He asked her to explain entries she had barely looked at herself in years, forcing her to articulate her father's methods and her own modifications in ways that clarified her own thinking. He found patterns in the germination data that she had recorded but not fully analyzed, cross-year correlations in drought survival that refined her understanding of which trait combinations were doing the most work. "This variety," he said one evening, holding up a notebook turned to an entry from 1878, "the one your father labeled as Cross 17B, you stopped the selection work on this one in 1880. My father was sick by then. There were only so many hours." The germination rate in the 1878 test was 68%. That's not spectacular, but look at the drought survival note. He wrote only that it held root integrity better than any other variety in the trial. Julia looked at the entry. She had seen it before, had noted it without fully processing it. "Root integrity," she said slowly. "If the root system holds under drought stress, the plant can recover when water returns. Most seed varieties, the seed is the whole product. But if you have a variety with superior root persistence, you have something different. You have something that could be planted as a perennial crop in marginal land. She stared at him. That is theoretical, she said carefully. All of it is theoretical until someone tests it, he said. She was quiet for a long moment, running the implications. Perennial root persistence in a grain crop would be something of genuinely revolutionary agricultural significance. It was the kind of thing that would make her father's work not just locally valuable but historically important. Cross 17B is in Vault 3, she said slowly. I have been maintaining the stock, but I have not been actively developing it. You should, he said. She looked at him across the lamplight. He was completely sincere, completely engaged with the intellectual substance of what he had just said, with no awareness at all of how the sight of him in her father's seed house, genuinely thinking about the hidden potential in her father's work with that particular focused intelligence in his thunderstorm eyes, was systematically dismantling her considerable defenses. Clayton, she said, and stopped. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the recognition of that fact moved through both of them simultaneously. She saw it in the slight stillness that came over him. Julia, he said quietly, which was the first time he had used hers. The silence was very large and very significant. She stood up from the work table. We should finish the label preparation for Vault 2's harvest batch, she said. The buyer's representatives are arriving the day after tomorrow. Of course, he said, with a gentleness in his voice that was something new. She sat back down. They worked until midnight, and neither of them said anything more that was not directly about seeds, and the warmth behind her sternum burned steadily and without letting up. The representatives came on the 1st of September. There were 4 of them, 2 farmers from the community of Grover's Mill 20 miles east, a representative from a cooperative farming association further east toward Wichita, and a man named Henry Pettigrew who was, to Julia's carefully suppressed astonishment, a correspondent of the Kansas State Agricultural College at Manhattan, who had apparently heard about the Talbot work through a chain of letters that traced back to one of her father's old scientific correspondences. She had not known about Pettigrew. She gave them a demonstration that she had prepared methodically, showing the comparison plots, walking them through the germination data in terms that were scientifically accurate but accessible, letting the numbers speak. The side-by-side survival comparison between her drought-resistant varieties and the conventional wheat at the field edges was so visually stark that 2 of the 4 visitors had almost nothing to say for a full minute after she finished presenting it. Clayton stood in the yard with the horses, ostensibly helping the visitors with their animals, actually watching everything with the quiet attention she had come to read as his highest form of engagement. Pettigrew from the Agricultural College asked her about Cross 17B. She looked at him sharply. Your father mentioned it in a letter to Professor Aldrich in 1879, Pettigrew said. He described a root persistence characteristic he had not yet had time to investigate fully. I was hoping it was still in your collection. It is, she said. The college would be very interested in supporting further development of that line, he said, both financially and with technical resources. We have greenhouse facilities and a soil science laboratory that might accelerate the testing considerably. Julia was perfectly still for a moment. You would need the seeds, she said, and the records. We would need to work with the seeds and records with you, Pettigrew said carefully. Under your direction, since you are the keeper of this collection's knowledge, I am not proposing to take your work, Miss Talbot. I am proposing a collaboration. She looked at him, reading him with the same care she applied to everything. He appeared to mean what he said. I will consider it, she said. First things first. The sale negotiations took the rest of the morning. By noon, she had commitments for seed purchases totaling $360. By early afternoon, after a further conversation with the cooperative representative who wanted a larger stock of the Turkey Red Cross than she had initially planned for, the total had reached $420. She was $8 over the debt. She stood in the ranch yard after the visitors had ridden out and did the arithmetic one more time, checking it against the bank letter's numbers, and the numbers held. They held with $8 to spare. She sat down on the porch step, which was not a thing she normally did in the middle of the afternoon, and put her face in her hands for a moment. Not crying, just feeling the full weight of what had just happened. 2 years of work, her father's 20 years before that, 340 acres and 107 seed varieties and 12 years of records, all of it right here, still standing. She heard Clayton's boots on the ground and looked up. He was looking at her with an expression that was so open and so warm that it hit her like a physical thing. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said, and immediately knew that the correction was true and also more revealing than she had intended it to be. The silence that followed had a different quality from any previous silence between them. It had the quality of something waiting to become what it already was. "Julia," he said. "The harvest needs to be packaged and the invoices need to be drafted," she said, standing up. "The buyer's representatives will return with payment in 3 days, and the stock needs to be properly prepared." "I know," he said. "I will help with all of that. But Julia—" She stopped with her back to him, looking out at the field where the wheat stood in the afternoon sun, and she felt the thing behind her sternum clearly and completely for the first time without trying to manage it. "I was planning to leave," he said behind her. "When the month was up, when the work was done, that was the plan." "I know," she said quietly. "I don't want to leave." She turned to face him. He was standing in the yard with his hat in his hand, and he looked stripped of armor in a way that she recognized because she felt the same way. "Clayton," she said, "I have spent 12 years in this place caring for things that most people cannot see the value of. My father's work, the seeds, this land. I have been content with that." She paused. "I have been content with that, and it has been sufficient, and I would not trade any of it." "I know that," he said. "But I think," she said, with the same precision she brought to everything, "that something I was not expecting has been growing in me these last weeks. And I am not the kind of woman who pretends not to see what is in front of her just because it is inconvenient." He crossed the yard in several steady steps and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head up to maintain the eye contact she was absolutely not going to relinquish. "I am not the kind of man who is good at staying," he said. "I have proven that repeatedly." "You have stayed here for 22 days without showing any sign of wanting to leave," she said. "That is your fault entirely." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the precursor to one. "Mr. Underwood, Miss Talbot, are you asking me something?" "I am trying to," he said. She let the almost smile become a real one, which was rare enough that he looked arrested by it. "Then ask it clearly. I have always preferred plain language." "I would like to stay," he said, "indefinitely. I would like to help you build what you are building here. And I would like, if you are willing, to learn what it is to care about someone who is worth caring about. Because I have been moving for 3 years, and I have just now understood what I was moving toward." Julia Talbot was a woman who applied scientific rigor to most decisions, and who distrusted romanticism as a poor substitute for evidence. But she had been observing Clayton Underwood for 22 days with the same careful attention she brought to her germination data, and the evidence was clear. "That would be agreeable to me," she said. He lifted his hand and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face with a carefulness that was both gentle and entirely certain, and she let him, which was itself a greater act of trust than she had extended to anyone in 2 years. "Good," he said. The first time he kissed her was 2 days later, by the drying racks in the early morning, with the sunrise painting everything amber and the smell of drying wheat seed in the warm air. It was not impulsive or accidental. It was an entirely deliberate act of 2 people who had been moving in this direction for 3 weeks, and who had both privately acknowledged that it was going to happen. It was, like everything between them, preceded by clear intention and followed by complete conviction. She kissed him back with the same certainty with which she did everything, and he held her with the particular care of a man who understood that what he was holding was irreplaceable. When she pulled back, she looked at him with her dark, intelligent eyes and said, The packaged seed orders still need to be completed. He laughed, which she was finding she loved. I know. After, she said. After, he agreed, and let her go. They rode into Harwood's Crossing together 5 days later, on the morning of the 6th of September, with a bank draft for $420 from the Agricultural Cooperative and individual buyers' payments that brought the total to the balance exactly required to satisfy the debt. She wore her best dress, which was clean and practical and dignified, and he rode beside her in a clean shirt with his boots brushed, and several people in town watched them ride past with expressions that mixed surprise and curiosity in equal measure. At the bank, she paid the debt in full. The teller, a young man who had the grace to look somewhat embarrassed, wrote her a full receipt and had the branch manager, a florid man named Elias Drummond, sign the satisfaction of debt document. She folded the document and placed it inside her coat, next to her heart, which was sentimental of her, and she did not care at all. On the way out, they passed Grover Tench, who was coming in the door. He stopped and looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise into calculation and finally settled on a careful blankness. "Miss Talbot," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Tench," she said pleasantly and walked past him. Clayton held the door and followed her out, and she heard him say quietly without stopping to Tench, "You'll want to pass that news along to Carlson." His voice was completely even and entirely pleasant, and it held an absolute finality that required no further elaboration. On the street outside, she looked at Clayton. He looked at her. She took his arm, which she had not done before, and they walked to the general store to buy the supplies they actually needed, and the warmth in her chest was so complete and steady that it had ceased to be something she was managing and had become simply part of how she felt. The months that followed were the fullest of Clayton's life. He had been a man defined by movement for 3 years, and the cessation of that movement was not the constrained thing he had feared it might be. It was the opposite. When the energy of constant transition was removed, what remained was not emptiness but presence. The actual texture of a day, the specific quality of the early morning light in the Kansas flat country, the sound of the wind in the maturing fields, the particular way Julia looked when she was deep in her notebook and had forgotten he was in the room. All of it was vivid and particular in a way the blur of the trail never had been. He wrote a letter to the remaining people he still had contact with from his Dodge City years, one of whom was a woman named Mildred Cass, who had been a friend to both him and Roy in the earlier days. He told Mildred where he was and that he was well, and that he had stopped moving. Mildred wrote back that Roy Dunbar had been found dead in a gambling dispute in Denver the previous winter, which was not a surprise but which Clayton received with a complicated grief, the complicated grief of a betrayal that had become old enough to also be a loss. He told Julia about it that evening. She listened to the full story again, this time including the grief parts he had previously omitted, and she put her hand over his on the table and left it there, which was the exactly correct response in a way that required no analysis. "Grief and anger do not have to separate," she said. "You can lose someone who also hurt you. The two things are both true." "I know that now," he said. "My father knew it. He had a friend in his Ohio days who disappointed him badly. He used to say that the capacity to be hurt by someone is a direct measure of how much you cared for them. He did not think it was wise to regret the caring." Clayton looked at her. "Your father sounds like he was someone worth knowing." "He was extraordinary," she said simply. "You would have liked him and he would have liked you, which is not something I could say about every man I have known." The collaboration with Henry Pettigrew and the Kansas State Agricultural College was formalized in November, when Pettigrew made a second visit to the ranch, with a formal letter of agreement that Julia reviewed with the careful legal attention of someone who had recently learned from direct experience what it meant to be the bearer of a valuable asset in a land where powerful men felt entitled to other people's work. The agreement was equitable. She retained ownership of the seed collection and all derivatives. The college provided laboratory access and a small annual stipend in exchange for the right to publish research findings with Julia's name as lead researcher. Cross 17b, the variety with the suspected perennial root persistence, would be the first formal subject of study. She signed the agreement with a hand that was steady, and she allowed herself the private acknowledgement that her father, who had spent 20 years on the margin of the scientific establishment he belonged in, would have been wildly proud. Clayton drove her to the college in Manhattan in January of 1883, a 2-day journey each way by wagon, to conduct the first formal consultation with the college's soil science faculty. The faculty member, a Professor Edwin Ware, was a careful and precise man who treated Julia with an immediate professional respect that she recognized was not universal in academic contexts in 1883, and that she therefore appreciated explicitly. They were on the road back, a day out of Manhattan, with the winter plains wide and white around them and the wagon blanket pulled up against the cold, when Clayton said, "Marry me." Julia looked at him from under the blanket. The wagon was moving at a steady walk, his attention nominally on the road, which was straight and empty and obvious. "That's not how you ask," she said. He pulled the horse to a stop. He turned on the seat to face her fully, and she could see he had been thinking about this since at least Manhattan, possibly longer. "Julia Ann Talbot," he said, with the full weight of complete intention. "I am a man who spent 3 years running from a betrayal that taught him the wrong lesson. The wrong lesson was that trust was a trap. The right lesson, which you have taught me by example and without any effort at instruction, is that trust is not a trap but a choice, and the quality of the trust available to you depends entirely on the quality of the person you extend it to." He stopped. "I am asking you to extend it to me permanently. I am asking you to let me stay, for the rest of both our lives, on the land you are growing back from nothing. I am asking you to let me be the person who is there when the next crisis comes and the one after that. I am asking you to be my wife." The winter wind moved across the flat country around them. An enormous sky, white and pale blue, pressed down on the world. "I have one condition," she said. "I know you do. You don't get to call it my land," she said. "I mean that precisely. The ranch belongs to the work and the seeds and the vision my father built and I have built after him. I don't hold it personally. I hold it in trust for what it represents and what it will continue to represent. I am asking you to understand that and to be a partner in that understanding, not a proprietor and not a laborer, a true partner." "I understood that about you before the first week was out," he said. "I would not want it any other way." She regarded him for a full 10 seconds, in which the prairie wind moved through the horse's mane, and a distant hawk crossed the pale sky. "Yes," she said. He kissed her in the middle of the road in the Kansas January cold, with no one watching for 20 miles in any direction, and it tasted like conviction and arrival all at once. They were married in March of 1883, in the small church in Harwood's Crossing, by the same minister who had buried Thomas Talbot 3 years before. Julia wore a dress she had made from a length of ivory cotton that she had ordered from Wichita, practical and clean-lined as everything she chose. Clayton wore his good suit, cleaned and pressed, and he stood beside her with the steadiness of a man who has found the specific ground he intends to stand on for the rest of his life. There were a handful of guests, 3 neighboring farm families who had bought seed from Julia and become something approaching friends. Henry Pettigrew, who had ridden from Manhattan specifically for the occasion. Old Margaret Hale, who ran the dry goods store in town, and who had extended Julia credit in the worst months of the previous year's crisis, when most others had not. After the ceremony, standing in the thin March sunshine outside the church while the small group offered congratulations, Julia stood beside Clayton and felt the weight and shape of her life with a clarity that was almost scientific in its precision. The ranch, the seeds, her father's work, now continued and expanded and finally seen by the wider world it deserved. And beside her, A man with thunderstorm eyes and strong hands, and a mind that matched hers in the ways that mattered, who had ridden in thinking the place was finished, and had stayed to help her prove that it was not even close to finished. It was barely beginning. Wade Carlson made one more attempt. It came in April, 2 months after the marriage, in the form of a visit that was not preceded by any message or warning, which was itself a statement of aggression. He rode in with 2 men and sat on his horse in the ranch yard in the way that Tench had sat, the unmounted rudeness, the assertion of dominance over space. He was a large man, older, with the particular confidence of someone who had purchased his way through most obstacles for long enough to believe that everything was purchasable. He looked at Julia and then at Clayton, and did the recalculation the way Tench had, and seemed to find the new configuration less favorable for his purposes. Mrs. Underwood, he said, which Julia noted was a choice of address designed to reframe her in terms of her husband. Mr. Carlson, she said pleasantly. I understand you have been working with the agricultural college, he said, making quite a name for yourself. The work is the work, she said. I have a proposition, he said. I am prepared to offer you a partnership arrangement. This operation, the seed collection, all of it, incorporated into my agricultural holdings, with you retained in a consulting capacity at a generous salary. She let him finish. No, she said. He had expected negotiation. The flat negative disrupted him visibly. Mrs. Underwood, the resources I can bring to this operation, the answer is no, she said. It will continue to be no on any subsequent visit. The Talbot Seed Ranch is not for sale, not for partnership, not for incorporation. What it is an independent operation with a formal research agreement with the state college, increasing regional seed sales and the full backing of its legal ownership. Mr. Carlson, you should look east of here for your expansion. There is nothing in this direction for you. The 2 men with Carlson were looking at Clayton, who had come out of the barn and was standing at the edge of the yard with a completely neutral expression, and the particular stillness she recognized as his version of very serious readiness. He was not threatening. He was simply present, in the specific way that a man like Clayton Underwood could be present, which communicated everything that needed communicating without a word. Carlson looked between them. He appeared to complete an accurate assessment. Good day, Mrs. Underwood, he said, and turned his horse. The 3 of them rode out. Clayton walked across the yard to where she stood, and she looked up at him. Well, she said. Do you think he'll be back? No, she said. Men like Carlson go where resistance is lowest. There are plenty of easier targets between here and Wichita. Clayton nodded. Then he looked at her with the expression she knew now, the one that was open and warm and entirely certain. You were magnificent. I was businesslike, she said with a slight smile. Same thing, he said, and kissed her forehead and went back to what he had been doing. By the summer of 1883, the seed sales had expanded to include a network of 11 farm communities across a 100-mile stretch of central Kansas. The drought-resistant Turkey Red Cross was in its first year of full commercial availability, and the early reports from buyers who had planted it in the spring were extraordinary. 2 farms that had planted both the conventional and the drought-resistant varieties side by side for comparison, inspired by Julia's own demonstration method, were already writing to her with data that confirmed, and in some cases exceeded her own test plot results. Henry Pettigrew published the first scientific paper on the collection in the fall of 1883 in the Kansas Farmer, a widely read agricultural journal. The paper, authored jointly by Julia and Pettigrew, described the breeding methodology and the drought survival data for the Turkey Red Cross in terms accessible to practical farmers, but scientifically rigorous. It generated a response that surprised even Pettigrew, letters from agricultural societies in 3 other states, an inquiry from a federal agricultural surveyor, and a letter from a professor at Ohio State University who had apparently been corresponding with Thomas Talbot years before his death, and who had not known until reading the paper that the work had continued. Julia read the Ohio State letter twice, carefully, and then sat with it for a long moment. "My father wrote to Professor Hartwell at Ohio State in 1877, she told Clayton that evening. "He never told me about it. This man, Hartwell, says my father sent him seed samples of the early cross varieties that year, and that Hartwell kept them. He says he has been trying to locate the main collection for 5 years. Clayton watched her face. "What are you feeling?" "That my father was building something larger than even I knew," she said. "That the work was always meant to be connected outward to the wider scientific community, and that his death and the debt crisis cut that connection before it was properly made." She paused. "I want to reestablish it. Then write to Hartwell." "I am going to," she said, "and I am going to suggest that he visit." She was pregnant by then, though she had not yet told Clayton, because she was not the kind of woman who told anyone anything before she was certain of it. She told him the following week, matter-of-factly, sitting at the work table in the seed house in the way she had come to do her most important talking, with the notebooks and the germination records around her like a framework of meaning. "I'm going to have a child," she said. "In the late winter, I think." He went still in the way she loved, the complete absorption. Then he looked at her with an expression that was so full it was almost undone by its own content. "Julia," he said. "I'm not fragile," she said immediately. "I intend to continue working through the pregnancy. The seed collection will not maintain itself, and the harvest season for the winter varieties begins in November. I will need you to take on more of the field work physically, but I can direct the selection and laboratory work from the seed house for as long as necessary." "I know you're not fragile," he said, with a softness that undid her defense before it was fully erected. He crossed to her and took her face in his hands, which were warm and calloused and careful, and looked at her with everything in his face at once. "I know exactly who you are, Julia. I have known since the second week. You are going to be a remarkable mother in the same way you are a remarkable everything else, which is by being completely and specifically yourself." She felt the warmth that was no longer something she managed, but simply something she lived inside. "That is a very good answer," she said. He kissed her, and she let the notebooks wait for a while. Professor Hartwell came in October, traveling from Ohio with 2 graduate students and enough scientific enthusiasm to fill the seed house 3 times over. He was a tall, lean man in his 60s with white hair and a voice like a lecture hall, and when he walked into the seed house and saw the scope of what Thomas Talbot's work had grown into, he took off his glasses and cleaned them with an unsteady hand. "My God," he said quietly. "Thomas always described it, but I did not understand." "My father was modest about his ambitions," Julia said. "It was a failing I am trying not to inherit." Hartwell looked at her with sharp academic eyes and then smiled with genuine warmth. "He described you, too. He said his daughter had surpassed him by 25. Julia absorbed this. "He never told me that." "He would not have," Hartwell said. "He was a scientist. He would not have offered praise that might affect your independent judgment of your own work. But he wrote it to me." He paused. "He was very proud of you, Mrs. Underwood." The full name caught her in a particular way in that particular moment, because she was Mrs. Underwood and also Julia Talbot and also her father's daughter and also the keeper of this collection, and all of those things were true simultaneously and did not conflict. "Thank you," she said, with more feeling than she usually allowed in professional contexts. Hartwell's visit lasted a week and produced a formal collaborative agreement between the Talbot Seed Ranch, the Kansas State Agricultural College, and the Ohio State Department of Botany. The 3-way research network that Thomas Talbot had been trying to build from a lonely Kansas ranch with letters and seed samples was, 20 years after its conception, finally real. Her son was born in January of 1884, during a snowstorm that came in from the northwest and buried the ranch in 2 feet of white. Clayton delivered him himself, with the help of Margaret Hale, who had driven out from town the previous day when the labor began, and Julia managed the process with the same focused precision she brought to every significant task, which made Clayton simultaneously awed and overwhelmed. They named him Thomas, for her father, and the middle name Hartwell, for the professor who had kept the seeds from Ohio. And he was a boy of 7 pounds and strong lungs who looked at the world from the first with an expression of acute assessment that Clayton said was going to make him either a scientist or a judge. Julia sat up in bed with the newborn Thomas against her chest and looked at Clayton sitting on the edge of the bed, both of them exhausted and lit from inside with something that was bigger than either of their individual capacities, and she said, "I am very glad you came down that road." "I almost didn't," he said. "I almost went north to Salina." "I know," she said, "and the seeds would have found another way because they always do, but I am glad it was you." He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, the three of them enclosed in the warmth of the small room while the Kansas winter pressed white and enormous against the window, and she felt the completeness of it like a fact. The world they built in the years after was specific and vivid and constantly expanding in the small ways that are the most real. The ranch grew. Not in the conventional sense of more cattle or more fenced acreage, but in the ways Julia measured growth, which were the ways that lasted. The seed collection, maintained now with Clayton as an equal partner in the field management and record keeping, expanded to 131 distinct varieties by 1885. The drought-resistant turkey Red Cross became widely enough distributed across central Kansas that it was referenced in the Kansas State Board of Agriculture's annual report as a significant factor in the reduced crop loss during the dry summer of 1884. The Perennial Root Persistence Research, Cross 17B, produced a paper in 1885 that was the first of what would become a long series of publications. Thomas Underwood grew up between the seed house and the fields with the particular freedom of a child, for whom the natural world is a laboratory rather than a background. He could identify 40 seed varieties by sight at age 3, which his mother had not planned as an educational exercise, but which had simply happened because he was always present in the seed house, and information in that house was always discussed aloud. A daughter, Eleanor, came in the spring of 1886, born in a more peaceful season than her brother, with warm air coming through the window and the smell of the first spring planting in the air. She had Clayton's gray eyes and Julia's focused look, and she took to the horses with a facility that was almost disturbing in its naturalness. By the time she was 2, she was perfectly comfortable in the barn, which was both gratifying and a source of continuous parental vigilance. A second son, James, came in 1889, when Thomas was 5 and Eleanor was 3. And the ranch had reached a kind of full warm stride that felt nothing like the desperate early years, and everything like what all of it had been building toward. James was the quietest of the 3 children, the most interior, a boy who sat and watched with a patience that reminded everyone of Clayton at his most focused, and who at age 4 showed a startling ability to sit still in the seed house for hours, absorbed in something that was probably more tactile than intellectual, but that Julia watched with the careful attention of someone who recognizes early indicators. Clayton's past closed itself in a quiet way in the autumn of 1887. A letter arrived from a law office in Dodge City, informing him that the Morrison land dispute had been revisited in light of new territorial court rulings, and that the sheriff who had been involved in the corruption that Clayton had tried to expose in 1879 had finally been removed from office and charged. The letter was from the attorney who had assembled the case, and he mentioned Clayton's earlier work as foundational documentation that had been preserved in court records, and stated that several of the affected homesteaders had been restored to their properties or compensated. Clayton read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again. Julia was watching him from the doorway. She did not say anything because she had learned the specific texture of moments that required silence. After a while he looked up. "It mattered," he said. "The work I did then, even after everything that went wrong with it, it mattered." "I know it did," she said. 3 years of running," he said. "And the thing I was running from was not the failure. It was thinking that my best effort had counted for nothing because Roy destroyed the trust. He paused, but the records were there. The work was there. Work that is true persists, Julia said. My father taught me that. You plant the seed and sometimes you don't see the harvest, but if the seed is true, the harvest comes. He stood up from the table and crossed to her and held her with his face against her hair, and she put her arms around him and held back with the particular certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she holds. I love you, he said. I want to say it plainly rather than assuming you know. I know, she said, but I am glad you said it plainly. I love you plainly back. By the time Thomas Underwood was old enough to truly understand what the ranch was, which was somewhere around his 7th year, when he started asking pointed questions about the seed vault keys and the record coding system, Julia had begun the process of teaching him with the same methodical care with which her father had taught her. Not urgently, not with any pressure of legacy, but with the patient clarity of a woman who understands that knowledge is only really kept when it is passed on. Clayton taught him the land, the way to read the weather in the prairie sky, the feel of soil between the fingers that tells you about moisture and composition, the specific attention that healthy plants ask for versus stressed ones. Between the two of them, the boy was receiving an education that combined science and earth in exactly the proportion that the work required. Alina declared at age 6 that she intended to breed the fastest horses in Kansas, which was greeted with affectionate seriousness by both parents and with genuine interest by Clayton, who knew enough about horses to understand that this was not an idle ambition but potentially a real one. He began teaching her the formal aspects of horse assessment and bloodline evaluation, and she absorbed it with the focused intelligence that she had clearly gotten from both parents and doubled by their combination. James turned out to be, as several people who knew them both suspected by the time he was 5, a born botanist in the strict sense. He did not talk about plants with the systematic analytical interest that his mother brought to them, but with something closer to intuition, an almost physical sympathy with growing things that manifested in the way they responded to his handling, and in the way he could identify a stressed plant before any visual symptom was apparent. Julia watched this with a scientific interest that she was careful not to perform in front of him, because she did not want to shape the thing she was observing. Your father had something like this, she told Clayton one evening much later, when James was 7, and the quality of his attention to growing things was unmistakable. He used to say that plants communicate if you know how to listen. I thought it was a romantic metaphor. With James, I think it may be a literal capacity. He is listening to something, Clayton agreed. Whether it's the plants or his own extraordinary sensitivity to observation, the output looks the same. Either way, she said, it's worth cultivating. He looked at her with a familiar warmth. Was that a pun? An unintentional one, she said, and the laughter they shared was easy and old and deep, the laughter of two people who have been making each other laugh for years and who still find the freshness in it. The Talbot Seed Ranch was, by the early 1890s, a name known well beyond central Kansas. The research connection with the agricultural colleges had expanded further, with correspondence now including institutions in Iowa and Illinois, and a letter from a European correspondent in Germany who had encountered the published papers and was conducting related research in European wheat varieties. Julia had made 2 trips to Kansas City to present research findings, once alone and once with Clayton, and both times had returned with new collaborative contacts and new seeds, because she always returned from anywhere with new seeds. Clayton had become, over the years, something that had no precise name on the frontier, but that everyone who came to the ranch understood immediately. He was the partner, in every complete sense of that word, of the woman who ran the operation. He managed the physical ranch, the irrigation, the buildings, the equipment, the field rotation, with the competence of a man who had been doing it for a decade, and who understood the underlying agricultural science well enough to make decisions independently. He managed the commercial relationships, the seed sales, the delivery logistics, the correspondence with buyers, because his capacity for clear practical communication was something that freed Julia to focus on the scientific work. He was also in the private accounting that mattered most, the person who knew her entirely and who had chosen to know her more each year, and who had never once in 10 years indicated by word or action that any part of what she was too much. She had not known in those early years that this was something she had been waiting for. She had thought she was content with her independence, and she had been, genuinely. But there is a specific kind of expansion that comes from being fully known by someone worthy of the knowing, and Julia Talbot Underwood, the most self-aware woman in central Kansas by general consensus, had the honest intelligence to acknowledge it. In the summer of 1893, with Thomas 9 years old and Eleanor 7 and James 4, and with the seed collection at 152 varieties, and the drought-resistant Turkey Red Cross, planted on an estimated 40,000 acres across the Great Plains, Julia and Clayton sat on the porch in the long summer evening with the smell of the fields around them, and the sound of the children somewhere behind the barn. And she leaned against his shoulder and looked at the 340 acres that she had refused to surrender. "My father would have liked this evening," she said. "Tell me," Clayton said. She thought for a moment. "He would have sat exactly here. He would have had his notebook, but he would not have been writing in it. He would have been listening to the fields. He always said that if you sat still long enough, the land told you what it needed." She paused. "And then he would have said something precise and unexpected that made you see the whole thing differently." "The way you do," Clayton said. She looked at him. "You do the same thing," he said. "You have always done it. I have been listening for 11 years. She held his gaze. "What is the most unexpected thing I have ever said to you?" He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "The morning you told me the sacrificial wheat planting," he said. "When you explained that what looked like a failing crop was a deliberate deception. That was when I understood that the surface story and the real story were always going to be different with you, and that my job was to know the real story." "And do you," she asked, "know the real story?" "Most of it," he said. "You tell me more each year." She turned to look back at the fields, at the line where the cultivated land met the original prairie, the place where her father had first identified the drought-resistant native varieties that had set everything in motion. The sun was setting behind the western hills, painting the grass in amber and rose. "The real story," she said, "is that my father planted something here that took longer to grow than he knew, and that the worst thing that could have happened, the debt and the loss and the threat of losing all of it, was the condition that made it grow harder, and that a man I did not expect came down a dusty road and looked at a dying ranch and saw something that looked finished." She paused. "And it turned out he was exactly wrong." "I was," he said. "The best mistake you ever made," she said. He put his arm around her, and they sat in the growing dusk, on the land that had been nearly lost and was never again going to be, while their children's voices drifted from behind the barn, and the Kansas evening settled warm and vast and full around everything they had built from nothing. She had grown it back. From the debt and the drought and the loneliness and the grief of her father's death, and the threat of men with money and empty smiles. From the bare bones of a vision that most people could not see. With her hands and her father's notebooks and her own ferocious intelligence, and the 12 years of patient scientific work that most of the world had not been watching. She had grown it back, and it was thriving, and it was going to outlast all of them. That was the seed keeper's way. You kept the seed through the bad seasons. You understood that dormancy was not death. You knew that what looked finished to a passing stranger was, in the secret interior of the seed vault, still perfectly alive and waiting for the conditions it needed. Julia Talbot had been waiting too. And Clayton Underwood had ridden in, looking for work, thinking the place was done, and had stayed to find out what things look like when someone who really knows what they are doing refuses to let them die. He was still finding out, every single day. And every single day, It was more than he had expected, which was, in the end, what love is, the daily astonishment of a person who keeps being more than you thought forever.